Legend of Zelda is all kinds of awesome. From exploring a vast and beautiful world in Breath of the Wild, to witnessing a doomed world suffering a terrible fate over and over again in Majora's Mask, to being able to turn into a puppy in Twilight Princess. The Zelda series has enjoyed a long history of trying new things with every entry. And with the highly anticipated Tears of the Kingdom fast approaching, or already finished depending on how fast Gator edits this thing, we figured now would be the best opportunity to discuss The Legend of Zelda again on the Gaming Gallery. I'm your host for today, TheOtakuArtist, once again breaking to the game office to narrate videos and steal sandwiches! Ooh, this time it's a chicken salad sandwich. And in today's episode of the Gaming Gallery, we'll be discussing the history of cancelled Zelda games. While we won't be going over every single cancelled Zelda game, as topics like Ura Zelda, Heroes of Hyrule, and Retro's Sheikah RP are honestly better suited for their own episodes, we'll be discussing a wide variety of topics that, for one reason or another, never saw the light of day. Some well-documented, some more obscure, and some that are a sequel to Link's crossbow training because why not? And without further ado, let's get this over with. To start off this video, let's go all the way back to the beginning of the Zelda series. The Legend of Zelda launched on the NES in 1986 and instantly became a fan favorite in the gaming community. With its popularity came the eventual sequel with Zelda II: The Adventures of Link. While the original game allowed players to freely explore a vast 2D world, the sequel set out to try new ideas such as 2D exploration in dungeons, a life counter, and experience points you'd normally find in an RPG. The later idea would see a major focus as Nintendo began developing the third Zelda game, which was planned to lean further into incorporating RPG concepts into the series. Miyamoto's original plan was for Zelda III to feature a party system. Link would be the main protagonist, exploring Hyrule alongside two new characters, a magic user and a fairy girl. Not much is known about the story, but it likely would have been similar to the original concept for what Zelda III would eventually turn into, A Link to the Past. The idea of traveling between two worlds was always a key pillar in the project, dating back to a scrap plan for the original game. However, instead of traveling between a light and dark world, Link would travel between the past and distant future. The Hyrule we know and love today would be the game's past world, while the high-tech futuristic world would be the game's future world. No, not that one! Note for editing, show a picture of Epcot's future world, and yes, I am reading that editing note, just in case you forget. The only thing we've ever seen for Zelda 3's future world was this concept art of what future Zelda would have looked like. While this was technically something made for the original game, we do know a future world was something Nintendo wanted to revisit for Zelda 3. Future Hyrule unfortunately never made it into the final game, and while random technology like trains or guardians appearing in a fantasy world has become a series staple, we've still never seen a truly futuristic setting in Zelda. And according to Gator, he thinks that it's because Nintendo realized that future Zelda was too sexy for the hardware limitations at the time. Yeah, that's totally the reason. Thank you, Gator. Development on the game itself would start in 1988, right after the release of The Adventures of Link. Not much is known about the NES version, and it's unlikely we'll ever see gameplay footage or screenshots of this version, as Nintendo was mostly working on designing the concept, rather than actually doing the whole coding and programming thing. Full production wouldn't actually begin until a year later when the project was moved to the Super Nintendo. Miyamoto would later drop the party system. It's not known why, but here's our editor's theory based off barely any evidence and mostly speculation. Miyamoto has said he sees Zelda II: The Adventures of Link as a failure, so it's likely he felt the side-scrolling and RPG elements moved the game too far away from what he wanted in a Zelda series, which is why A Link to the Past was a more return-to form for what the original game set out to do. To summarize, Zelda III begins development on the NES. 1 year later, it becomes A Link to the Past on the NES, dropping the 3-character party and future Hyrule in favor of world exploration and a light and dark world, and in the end, A Link to the Past would release to a critical acclaim, becoming one of the most beloved video games of all time. Even if its follow-up, Link's Awakening, is better. Okay, I will ad-lib something, but I do agree with you because I actually don't like A Link to the Past. Even if its follow-up, Link's Awakening, is better. However, that's just what it says in the script because everyone knows Twilight Princess is actually the best Zelda game. Now, let's move over to the Game Boy for a couple more cancelled games. After the release of Link's Awakening, Capcom director Yoshiki Akamoto approached Shigeru Miyamoto with a partnership between Capcom and Nintendo. The plan was simple. Start off with a Game Boy remake of the original Zelda game, followed by a trilogy of new games that connect to each other as the same vein as Pokémon. While Nintendo was enthusiastic with the proposal, they insisted Capcom go straight into the new trilogy instead. And with that, development began on The Legend of Zelda: Mystical Seeds of Wisdom, Power, and Courage. Miyamoto suggested each game would be focused on a different gameplay idea. Mystical Seed of Power would feature the changing of the 4 seasons, Mystical Seed of Courage would feature changing the time of day, and Mystical Seed of Wisdom would feature puzzles based on colors, taking advantage of the Game Boy Color and making life hell for colorblind gamers while doing so. Each game would star a different oracle. Seed of Power was originally going to star Zelda, but became the dancing Lady Din. Seed of Courage would star the singer Furore, and Seed of Wisdom would star the painter Nehru. The original plan was to follow Pokemon's release strategy, release 2 versions simultaneously, followed by a 3rd version later. As development progressed, it was decided coordinating 3 games to interact with each other would be too complicated. This worked for Pokemon because the most each game interacts usually boils down to trading Pokemon across each version. The Mystical Seed trilogy had 3 separate storylines interacting with each other and unlocking items between the games. In the end, the 3rd version, Mystical Seed of Courage, would be cancelled. The color puzzles would be scrapped, Nehru and the day and night puzzle would be moved to Mystical Seed of Wisdom, and the other 2 games would be renamed, Oracle of Seasons and Ages. Moving forward ahead in the timeline, now let's discuss a handful of sequels that sadly never saw the light of day. Doesn't that sound like fun? First up, The Wind Waker. Nintendo wanted to continue the game's story with a direct follow-up. This is purely speculation on our part, but it's likely the sequel would have focused on establishing a new Hyrule after the events of The Wind Waker. The game would have had a larger focus on land exploration, with Link being able to travel on horseback, similar to the N64 games, but on a larger scale. However, series producer Eiji Aonuma was worried the sequel wouldn't sell well. While The Wind Waker would go on to sell over 1 million copies, North American sales weren't as strong as previous games. Believe it or not, there was once a time when people weren't too fond of this game. The art style was a huge departure from what Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask established, so losers and dorks of the era figured, "Psst, that's not what I want Zelda to look like! I want realism on my GameCube, damn it!" And thus Nintendo of America was convinced Zelda fans weren't fond on the cel-shaded art style. Aonuma figured a realistic art style similar to the GameCube tech demo would satisfy the North American audience. When he pitched this idea to Shigeru Miyamoto, he was hesitant that a simple change in art style would be enough, and challenged Aonuma to revisit ideas that couldn't be done on the N64. With this in mind, one of the top priorities was fighting enemies with a sword on horseback, which was the final nail in the coffin for the cel-shaded graphics, as Toon Link's proportions made this difficult to animate in a satisfying way. While this worked in Four Swords Adventures, getting this to look nice in a 3D environment was a different story. With this change in art style, the project would be reworked into my favorite Zelda game, Twilight Princess. History would repeat itself later, as though Twilight Princess has its own cancelled sequel. Yay! After development wrapped up on the game, Nintendo was eager to create a follow-up to capitalize on the popularity. After all, Twilight Princess was becoming the fastest-selling Zelda game of all time. They just spent the last several years creating this beautifully detailed, realistic world. It's a no-brainer to create an assets reusing sequel like Majora's Mask. Which is why Miyamoto decided that sounds too awesome, and have the development team make Link's crossbow training instead. Miyamoto decided to make a more simplistic, spin-off shooting gallery set in the world of Twilight Princess, taking advantage of the Wii Zapper. To keep development time short, Miyamoto insisted on no story, no long cutscenes, levels had to be completed in a short amount of time, and no boss fights. This was a devastating blow to the development team who were already working on grand plans for a proper sequel. Compromises were made between Miyamoto and the dev team, allowing one boss fight and removing Miyamoto's idea of Link to use a real-world weapon. So, while Link's crossbow training is still a fun game on its own, the fact that we could have gotten a proper Twilight Princess sequel still hurts after all this time. Which is why it's funny Link's crossbow training has its own cancelled sequel. Eiji Aonuma wanted to create a follow-up after playing Link's crossbow training himself. Wanting to go further with the concept, Aonuma had plans to include online multiplayer using Nintendo Wi-Fi connection and a more grand story. However, Nintendo's higher-ups rejected the idea, instead wanting Aonuma to produce a more original Zelda game to take advantage of the Wii, which would become Skyward Sword. Imagine another cursed timeline where we got a sequel to Link's crossbow training instead of Skyward Sword. Ugh. Skyward Sword would endure a rough development cycle, with Aonuma's team going years of trial and error to figure out the direction to take the project, often going back and forth over whether one-to-one motion controls were even necessary. With so much time spent experimenting with ideas, once Nintendo finally had a focal point and direction, they were eager to have the game out before the shiny new Wii U took attention from fans. While a dual console release was possible with Twilight Princess thanks to the similar hardware between the Wii and GameCube, they couldn't replicate this release strategy with Skyward Sword. Because of the difference in power, releasing the game for Wii U would mean having to greatly enhance the game's visuals, and figure out ways to take advantage of the Wii U gamepad. Former president of Nintendo of America, Reggie Fils-Aimé, would confirm in an interview that because Skyward Sword was designed around the Wii Remote, it wouldn't make sense to have a dual release along a Wii U. With this in mind, it makes sense Nintendo would want the game released within a reasonable amount of time. And with that, several ideas would be scrapped midway through development. Probably the most ambitious idea that didn't make it into the final game was the second quest. While most second quests in Zelda games usually boil down to a more difficult mode, or leading to Master Quests in the events of Ocarina of Time, Skyward Sword's second quest was to feature an original storyline told from Zelda's perspective. Players would begin the quest as Zelda first arrived on the surface, being chased by bokoblins until being saved by the old woman who helps her pray in the Faron Springs. Faron Springs, It's probably Faron. Faron? Faron Springs? Faron? I don't know. I give up. She'd then meet up with Impa in the Elven Volcano as the two stayed one step ahead of G.A.M.E. While it's unknown how exactly the second quest would have played, it's reasonable to assume it would have revolved around one more trek through each of the game's region. And this is purely speculation, but combat may have been an important role too. It's implied throughout the first half of Skyward Sword that Zelda ran into many of the same characters Link did, with the Kikwis outright confirming Zelda helped fend off the attacking bokoblins chasing them. Considering she was also a student at the Knight Academy, it makes sense she'd be able to fight monsters too. The second quest would likely end at the point where Zelda arrives at the Gate of Time in the Lanayru Desert. We have a clearer idea what happens to Zelda in-game after this point, so the second quest would have likely only followed Zelda's story throughout the first half of the game. Unfortunately, the idea was never realized. As Skyward Sword's development was rushed to completion before the Wii U released, the second quest was sadly one of the many concepts that didn't see the light of day, even in the HD remake on Switch. And while the gameplay would be scrapped, the story of the second quest itself would see its way into the final game, with the cinematics playing during the credits. So it's nice this ambitious idea made its way into the game in some form. Which begs the question, why the hell wasn't this added back in Skyward Sword HD? The areas were finished, the story was written. Xenoblade Chronicles also had a scrap second story in the original release that made its way back into the Switch version. So why not Skyward Sword? To wrap up this video, let's quickly run through some more cancelled Zelda games that also never saw the light of day. In 2003, a pitch for a Game Boy Advance version of The Wind Waker was made by David Solani and Fabio Paghetti, who'd go on to work on Mario + Rabbids Kingdom Battle. This pitch never made it further than the company higher-ups, so nothing ever came of it. It's unclear whether this would have been a GBA remake of The Wind Waker or a sequel. Vanpool, who's responsible for the monstrosities that are the 2DS Tingle games, freshly picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land, and Iradzuki Tingo no Koi no Balloon Trip, were at one point working on a third Tingle game. This was intended to be the first horror game set in the Zelda universe, but was cancelled for a variety of reasons. Probably for the best. I personally love Tingle, and I would love to see a horror game with Tingle, because as we all know it, Tingle is already very horrifying. And the last topic we'll discuss in today's video involves The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. While this wasn't intended to be released as a full game, something worth highlighting was that the entire map of Breath of the Wild was created using a 2D Zelda engine. This prototype was made to demonstrate to the development team what they wanted to achieve with the new game, which was easier to showcase in 2D before full production went into 3D. Again, this wasn't meant to ever release as a full game, but it's still a neat piece of history. And that's all for today, but don't forget to check out other gaming galleries. There's some Zelda goodness on here if you're into that sort of thing, some of which may have also been narrated by yours truly. And if you like more Zelda content and want to hear me continue to blabber on about my favorite Nintendo games, why not head on over to my channel? On my channel, you'll find a bunch of Nintendo and video game goodness, as well as animations, let's plays, and more. So, why not head on over and check it out? And as always, thank you for watching this episode of the Gaming Gallery, and remember that in our hearts, we are gamers. See you next time, and next time I record another one of these, I will steal another sandwich. Your sandwiches will never be safe from me.